Hello and welcome to our latest Critical Conversation event and the first in our three-part mini-series on engineering and a just transition to net zero. My name's Hayaatun Sillem and I'm the Chief Executive at the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering Foundation. And it's my very great pleasure to be hosting another of these online fireside chats where we explore topical issues that are important for engineering and for society. This Net Zero mini-series of Critical Conversations will explore how the transformations in engineering and technology that are needed for decarbonising our society and our economy will impact and affect the lives of people, both in the UK and beyond. And in this first event, we'll focus on the energy system transformation, with the second one looking at transformations in our transport system, and then the final event at retrofitting the buildings we occupy in our daily lives. So let's get back to today's agenda. Like many other countries, the UK needs to rapidly transform and upgrade the way we produce, use, store, and transmit energy. And that is going to entail the most dramatic change in how we heat and power everyday life at home, on the move, at work, since the creation of the early electricity grid back in the 1920s. To meet our international obligations to achieve net zero by 2050, we are going to have to shift to different renewable forms of generation, which are much more distributed around the country, more local. And of course, this is going to mean significant change for the country and for communities. Opportunities will include having more locally produced and consumed energy, both domestic and commercial, could enable us to manage and use energy more efficiently. And it could provide opportunities to be not just consumers, but also producers of renewable energy. It's also going to mean that our distribution and transmission system will need to be comprehensively upgraded to support this more dynamic and local generation, as well as to bring renewable energy to centres of energy demand and consumption. Now, in charting our path through this profound system change, it's going to be absolutely vital that the publics and the communities who will be most affected by this rapid and extensive transformation are engaged in a meaningful way throughout that process. We know that notwithstanding the scale of the benefits and the strength of the imperative, there are going to be many challenges along this transition, some specific to particular communities, localities, places, others with perhaps more far-reaching, even universal impacts. They may affect us all. And balancing how we share the costs and benefits is going to be crucial to all of this if we are to achieve an effective and a just transition. I'm absolutely delighted that we're going to be exploring these very important questions with a brilliant panel of experts whose work and interests span the full breadth of these issues, from centralised planning of the electricity system down to the micro level of community engagement. So first of all, we have Patrick Devine-Wright. Patrick is Professor in Human Geography at the University of Exeter, specialising in research investigating social and psychological aspects of energy transitions, in particular siting controversies, so-called NIMBYism, public participation and community engagement. Secondly, we have Laura Watts. Laura is a writer and visiting professor at the Centre for Applied Ecological Thinking at the University of Copenhagen. And her award-winning book, Energy at the End of the World, an Orkney Island Saga, documents a long-term ethnographic study of and collaborations with communities and organisations in Orkney who have been making their renewable energy transition for over 20 years. And finally, delighted to be joined by Nick Windsor. Nick is Electricity Networks Commissioner and until recently Chair of the Energy Systems Catapult. And as Electricity Networks Commissioner, his 2023 report to government detailed 18 key recommendations for decarbonising the energy network, including suggestions for how we make the planning and design of infrastructure more transparent and understandable to the communities that are affected, and on the kinds of engagement that is needed with those communities. So we've got a brilliant panel and we'd love you to get involved. So please just drop your questions into the comments on the LinkedIn page, and we will try to get through as many of those as possible during the next just under an hour. But I'm going to kick things off and get the ball rolling by asking our panellists just a few introductory questions. So Patrick, I'm going to turn to you first. I've used the phrase just transition. Could you just start by giving us a brief summary of what a just transition means to you?
Thank you very much. I'll do my best as briefly as possible. I mean, I think I'd like to start by saying that what I like about this term, what it does for me anyway, is that it reminds us that energy transitions are not just about technologies, they're not just processes of technological change. They are what we could call socio-technical things. And that means you've got to think carefully about not only the technological, but all of the social dimensions wrapped up in that. And that's not just impacts, but also the kind of ways in which society feeds into technology design and deployment. So thinking carefully about what a socio-technical approach to energy transitions might look like. And that means drawing on different kinds of expertise and knowledges, the social sciences as much as the engineering and physical sciences, and making sure we get that integration right, get those conversations happening across disciplinary boundaries and different kinds of expertise. And of course, that's what this event is about as well, which is why I was so pleased to be involved in today. I think just transition can be narrowly defined, really in terms of jobs and livelihoods, with a kind of focus on the individuals, the communities, the sectors that are currently working in maybe the hydrocarbon energy systems, and thinking carefully about how they can shift over towards low carbon energy sectors, how we reskill people in communities, and how we make sure that people and places are not left behind in this energy transition that we're talking about. But I would say that if we think about it in terms of justice very carefully, then that opens it out into a much broader set of conversations. And environmental justice is something that social scientists have been writing about for many years. It's a field of activism as well that stemmed from work in the United States. And it thinks about justice in three main dimensions. So distributional justice, which is how the costs and the benefits of any changes are distributed, to whom and how fair is that. Procedural justice, which is about the fairness of decision-making processes. Are they transparent? Are they equitable? Are they open? Do people feel as if it's a fair process of making decisions, or is it being imposed top down? And then finally, issues around recognition, which is about what kind of ideas or information or kind of grounds are considered to be relevant in making decisions about change. So recognition is important as well. Often things are ruled out of relevance because they're not considered to be valid or appropriate things to be said, and get marginalized in that sense. So what kind of knowledge or expertise is considered appropriate is also relevant for recognition justice as well. So if we think about just transition in those broader terms, it's about addressing those different dimensions of fairness as ably as we can in any process of technology transition, like across the different energy domains you set out in the beginning.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Patrick. You did a great job of trying to distill a very large and complex topic into something that just helps make sure we've got some appropriate framing for our discussion today. And Laura, can I ask you to build on that by just saying a bit about why you think it's important that we engage communities and publics alongside the technical experts?
Yeah, thanks very much. I do very much want to build on what Patrick just said. Because when we talk about communities, we often assume they're sort of out there waiting for us to just talk to. But actually, communities are processes and practices. They're things that we have to do. We have to make. People aren't just magically part of a community. You have to spend time, you have to spend work, you have to spend effort, you have to maintain them. So in a way, if you're a technical person, you kind of need to remember that communities like infrastructure have to be made and maintained. So when we're thinking about engaging with the communities, we have to start with an understanding that these are things that is going to take time to do. And we need to think about how much effort it's going to take for communities to make themselves, to participate and to collaborate back with us. So that's the first thing. And that's why it's important to do that community making work. The second thing I would say that's crucial is that there's also enough of this assumption that there's this kind of weird opposition between people over here and communities over here and technology over here. And when you separate things into those two categories, you're essentially setting things up in opposition. And what do we find? We find opposition. We have kind of people in opposition to technology, but that's part of because we framed the engagement that way. Whereas if we kind of rethink about the ways in which communities are already participant in places, communities of people involved in like the Royal Academy of Engineering is a community of people, right? So, communities are made up of people who are part of other communities, other kinds of organizations. So it's figuring out how we collaborate together and how we draw upon the existing technologies that are already embedded in those communities to recognize that we don't have a separation between these two. If you want to, put up a wind turbine or another piece of generation, it is an infrastructure. We need to think of it as a system that always includes people. And when you start from that perspective, you realize it's not even going to operate, it's not going to work until you actually start integrating people into the conversation. And my final point on this is the fact that, again, another one of these weird separations that sometimes happens is this idea that somehow there's people who don't know things with experts in technology who are over here who know the things. And actually, as I'm sure many people on this call will feel quite strongly about, people who live in places are the experts in those places. They are the people who will be able to know how you can install, whether it's pylons or installation or generation, or even what kind of technologies might be appropriate or relevant in that place. So it's about recognizing that there is tacit and local knowledge in the place that we need in order to make any of this just transition actually work. So that's why I think engagement is really crucial, is we have to draw this expertise together.
Fantastic, Laura, and thank you for helping us actually be a bit clearer about what some of these terms that we're using really mean in practice. So communities, experts, you're absolutely right to remind us that that is part of the framing and the process of engagement. So I'm going to now shift to you, Nick. And Nick, of course, you recently completed a very important review for previous government that was focused around acceleration, because we know that in trying to achieve the upgrading and decarbonisation of our electricity system, we're going to have to go faster than we have historically, at least in recent times. So it'd be really helpful if you can just give us an overview of your findings, perhaps focusing in on the areas which you think are most salient to today's discussion around publics and communities engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a curiosity, really, how significant the report is to this topic, to me anyway, because as an engineer, I sort of started off thinking about the timescales for building this stuff. We've got to build an awful lot of new assets, essentially a new energy system, very, very quickly to hit our targets. And I expected as an engineer, this was going to be about sort of how quickly can you get bits of steel and other, engineering things and sort of bolt them together. But of course, the report really isn't about that. As I produced the report, it turned out the report is really about the things we're going to talk about today, because to accelerate through the building of transmission assets, we need to take the public with us. We need to talk to communities. We need to explain why this is a great idea to do this transition, which I passionately believe it is for individuals, communities, and for the whole of our society. So the report ended up talking about the way that we propose new assets to society. And it turns out that for decades, in fact, we've essentially gone about this by looking at this in an asset by asset way. Engineers look at, say, a new wind farm and say, oh, well, we need a line from A to B, and that's it, and we go out to the community, and lo and behold, we find the community is quite often quite puzzled and sometimes quite angry about the idea of this. So the report essentially says that we need to change all of that and start at the other end. We need a strategic approach to planning the energy system, a strategic spatial approach, because where stuff is really important to communities and individuals. And so it talks about the need for strategic planning of our energy system as a whole, and the fact that that strategic plan needs to be shared in a sensible way with individuals and communities. In fact, the whole of our society. We need to have a vision for what we're trying to do, and we need to explain that clearly. Not just that, we need to articulate from government what government's trying to do with this, because there are democratically elected representatives, and how they set the priorities through setting and updating the national policy statements in a meaningful and relevant way is hugely important. And then finally, I suggested that we needed to be very transparent with communities as we talk to them about new assets, about what I call design principles. There are choices to be made by in terms of do new assets, where do they get built? Do they go under the sea? Do they go underground? Do they go overhead? And where do we put substations? And so explaining to people how we're making the economic, engineering, political, social trade-offs, technical trade-offs is absolutely critical. And the fact that we haven't done that in the past is why communities, in my view, have been sort of bewildered and quite often angry about proposals. I did also suggest some change to how we include communities by providing rewards in terms of community benefits, and that's part, I think, of the package. But what I've tried to come forward with is a way of having a more respectful, open, and informative discussion with communities that involves them fully in the new energy system. Because after all, I think we all believe that the new energy system will be cleaner, cheaper, and it will be a more exciting system, a more interesting system for people to participate in.
Thank you, Nick. Well, I think that's a brilliant reminder of why this topic is so important if we are to achieve a just transition. And I think there are quite a few points you've made there that and I'm sure our audience will want to come back to. I do encourage you in the audience to please drop your questions in so that we can cover as many as possible. But before we get on to those, I do just want to go back to Laura and Patrick, because you're both really deeply immersed in what we're talking about, public engagement, specific community engagement. What are your reflections about the nature of the transformation we're embarking on and how this can impact on communities, whether positively or negatively or neutrally? I'd just be really interested in hearing a bit more about that. Maybe start with you, Laura, because you mentioned mentioned the book that you've written about your experiences in Orkney. It'd be lovely to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very much hoping that some of my colleagues and collaborators from Orkney might be on the call. So if they are, please, put your questions, because you're the people who are actually doing this. Just to summarize, because I think it's important to recognize that we talk about the just transition. We often talk about moving to net zero. But where I've been working in Orkney, so those islands are off the northeast coast of Scotland, they have been involved in making the transition to renewable energy generation, at least since, I don't know what, 2005, possibly earlier. So the islands now generate over 120% of their electricity needs from their renewables. So that's across wave and tide energy. They have the European Marine Energy Centre test site, but majority is wind. They've got a bit of solar, biomass. So there's an extraordinary amount of local generations. This is people putting up micro wind turbines. There's people kind of getting EVs, which are essentially grid batteries on wheels. So when you're thinking about, where are we with a just transition, the answer is it varies depending on where you are. And different places are moving at different, I don't want to say speeds, because the way that people will change and adapt and communities experience the energy transitions can be very varied. And I just want to emphasize that it's already happening. It's already ongoing. And there are lots of places. I work in Orkney, but there are many other places which are essentially already there. There's more to be done for sure. But I wanted to emphasize that. So that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, to kind of go, look, you've got a place in Orkney which essentially has been doing this by itself. It's not a particularly wealthy place. It has extraordinary levels of fuel poverty. And if someone like Orkney, which is at the edge of the map, so it's kind of the leading edge in terms of renewable energy innovation, but also an edge in terms of being what you might think of as the periphery. Somewhere like that has been able to make this extraordinary transformation themselves. Then, how can we learn from that for other places? And I think for me, one of the things about that, which also connects to what Nick said, is about the self-determination of the islanders. So when you live at the edge, and a lot of people live on coastal locations, are the places where the renewable energy is. That's where the wind is. That's where the seas are, right? And these are the locations that often have the energy, have the power in a literal sense. But when you're living there, there's often you are living in more precarious infrastructures. And therefore, you often already have a sense of having to be self-determined, having to be a little bit more self-sufficient. It's just a natural way you're thinking. And, those places, I think, are ways that we can sort of look and learn about how you therefore might be self-sufficient or more self-deterministic with your renewable energy generation. So to connect to Nick, for example, in Orkney, one of the things they've been doing is the wind turbines that were installed by local owned trusts. So you have an island of maybe, I don't know, 100, 300 people who work together to install a local owned wind turbine. They then, that turbine goes round. So the kids in the school see their turbine going round, and they know that when they plug in their lights, they're essentially generating electricity for their local community, because when the turbine goes round, that generates electricity that gets sold to the national grid and generates a feed-in tariff. So the important thing there is the islands have a very personal relationship to the energy, a very particular personal relationship to the electricity. And I think that's part of what I think when I hear Nick talking, that project is trying to, and the report's trying to move towards, is how do we develop that sense of we have a choice. It's not just there's money raining down randomly, you know, for some kind of community benefit, but islanders and people who are involved in electricity grid are participants in it. And I think that's something which, you know, we're talking about now. And it's not a participation which is just, you know, kind of theoretical, but it is a sense of the fact that that electricity, that light bulb is on. And you know what? That's going to power our local school. You know, that's helping us islanders be more resilient, be more sustainable, and sustain our living for, you know, however many more hundreds of years that we hope people will be living in our communities.
So interesting, Laura. Thank you for bringing that to life for us. And I'm going to hand to Patrick to build on that, please.
Thank you very much. So I think really what Laura's brought to the fore, I think really clearly here, really nicely through the Orkney example is the idea of place, which is something that I've been interested in a long time. And I think it's a particularly interesting point to bring up to this audience in the sense that, I mean, I think engineers are taught to think systemically. And in some senses, I would suggest maybe an engineering perspective almost takes technology out of a social context. A wind turbine is a wind turbine is a wind turbine, etc. But if we think through the lens of place, it's an alternative way of seeing technology. It is emplaced in a particular part of the world, and that part of the world is unique. So it's a challenge to that. It's an alternative way of seeing things. Which human geography is very important in trying to kind of take forward. So I think energy transitions and grid extension in particular need to be seen through the lens of locality or place, recognizing that Orkney is different from you know, Devon's different from London. All of these different contexts need to be seen in their own right as different places and how energy transitions will work or not there. And I think the other thing which Ed mentioned is the idea of this broader overall vision. So I think just transition means that we need to think about net zero at national or societal levels as well as local levels. I don't think we should think too much today about the local. I really think we need to think about society. We need to think about net zero as a process of social change. And that's something that we've been doing in the Access project that I'm part of. We have a task force on net zero that will be reporting next week. And in that, we've been trying to think about net zero in terms of social change. Now, what that means is thinking through change at multiple levels, the national, the regional, the local. It's about thinking through visions. What are the narratives around net zero? What are our political representatives at the national level saying is the end goal? It can't just be about reducing emissions. It must be something about what kind of lives will we be leading in 2050 that are associated with low emissions. It'll be something about active travel. It'll be something about the food that we eat. It'll be something about the buildings and the homes that we live and work in. It'll be some kind of joined up picture which is consistent with the environment and climate emergency. I don't think we've seen enough of that kind of I guess, idea of those broader positive narratives that we're working towards, which is beyond just simply emissions reduction. And it's more a picture of what society is working towards and why this is a good thing for us to get behind and make sure that those ideas about the need case for a particular high voltage transmission line in a particular region of the country, how it connects up to that broader picture of 2050 targets or 2030 targets, which won't mean an awful lot to the public, let's face it, as policy targets, because they haven't been involved in those conversations. So the second point I was going to make about how we make this a societal process of socio-technical change is about this idea of dialogue and conversations. Now, I've recently finished a project funded under the IDRIC consortium about just transitions. And in that, we held stakeholder workshops and focus groups in industrial clusters around the UK. Now, these are communities that have lived with hazardous industries for a very long time, oil and gas refineries, fertilizer production. They're used to living cheek by jowl with very big infrastructure projects containing a lot of hazards and seeing these technologies come and go over generations. So like Laura, there is a kind of a lived experience there, a local knowledge, a local expertise that we need to tap into and not just kind of impose technologies on those places in a kind of a top-down manner. So I think we need to have kind of joined up critical conversations. When we spoke to residents in those places, they said they wanted honest, pragmatic dialogue from industry and companies. They don't tend to trust the energy industry stakeholders or utilities. They don't tend to trust policymakers very much either. So there's a huge issue there around how those levels of trust can be rebuilt and maintained so that any information that's communicated to those communities are actually listened to rather than people switching off from the start. And I think the conversation can't just be about the benefits. If we tell people, look, it'll be X number of jobs, it'll be X amount of investment, and there's no obvious downside in that communication. My understanding from the work we did in IDRIC is that people don't trust that. They can't imagine that it's only going to be great, that there aren't any downsides. And if there's lots of public investment going in or private sector investment, they join it up in a way that I don't think we always do when we focus on net zero. They're wondering about food banks in the local community or the fact that there's not a functioning local health centre. And they're thinking, well, how is that consistent with X 100 million investment or a massive new technology projects? And they kind of join it up from a kind of a local lived experience point of view. So coming back to the question again, I think if just transition is to mean something, it has to connect the local with the national, the societal with the place. It has to involve some kind of dialogue and conversations. And the good thing is that social science is really good in those two. We know how to do public deliberations. We know how to do citizens' juries and citizens' panels. So it's about making that expertise come to the fore and then making it real in these different places and joining up the national and the local.
Patrick, a whole raft of really important points in there, and I'm sure we're going to build on them in the course of this conversation, this critical conversation. And I do want to now start bringing audience questions. And because I'd like to get through as many of those as possible, I'll sort of throw them into the pool for discussion, and we'll try and make sure we do them all justice. But I think we're probably going to have to accept that we're not going to have time to do them all in great detail. But I'd like to start with a question from Wakas Arshad, who, in a way, it's picking up on Patrick's point about the sort of, the risk of being a bit Pollyanna about all the opportunity and the upside. And Wakas's question is, are we going to enforce net zero? What if people can't afford to be a part of a transition to net zero? So I'm sure, Laura, you'd like to come in, but I'll just turn to Nick first to see if Nick would like to kick us off. Thank you.
I'd be delighted to. It's a complex position. This, I mean, I think that the highest level analysis of this is that actually as a society we can afford net zero. We do need to escape the narrative that we've been prisoners of, which is that we have to do this for the climate, but it's going to be expensive. The analysis does not show that. The analysis is starting to show quite clearly that we can have not only a cleaner energy system, but a cheaper energy system. So at that level, that's great news. That's a good start. We then need to think about the distributional effects within that. There's a substantial amount of capital investment needed. We need to make sure that goes in a way that can be funded and smoothed through time and allocated to some extent where the benefits are, so that everybody can feel the benefits and that we don't have some winners and losers occurring. But to start with a cheaper position, that's certainly very helpful to this debate. And of course, as we go through the transition, we need to think about, in particular, where there's capital to be spent at a household level that will lead to long-term benefits, but there isn't capital available in some of the poorer households, lower income households, how that should be dealt with. And you'll be aware that I'm on the National Infrastructure Commission, and we saw proposals come forward for paying for example, heat pumps and other home insulation for those categories.
Thank you very much, Nick. That's very helpful. I'm going to turn to Laura to build on that. And you might want to also pick up John Gardner's question, just a kind of point of clarification about the non-renewable sources of energy in Orkney. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I felt like Nick covered off the net zero question really well. So I think there are things to say about net zero with respect to what Patrick was also saying, that it's not about counting the carbon, it's about the experience. But I would like to really use the time to obviously pick up as many questions from the audience as possible. So just to thank John Gardner, because he asked an excellent question around, what happens when the wind's not blowing in Orkney? And it is a really important question. In a way, it's kind of like one of the big questions about renewable energy. What do we do when we have intermittent sources of renewable energy? At night, the sun's not up and, the wind does stop blowing. So what are we going to do? What's fascinating is that in Orkney, it is on-grid, which means that not only does it allow the possibility for Orkney to export its overproduction of renewable energy to the south, to the rest of the UK, but it also means if the wind isn't blowing or the tide isn't turning, then you can pull electricity from the main grid in the UK, so from Caithness, wind turbines, or where else. But what's really interesting is, of course, that depends on having the pipes or the cables. And that is an ongoing debate across the UK at the moment, is that do we have sufficient infrastructure? Do we have the cables in the places where we need them? We have offshore wind turbines that want to be built in the UK, but they can't get connected to grid and are waiting for 15 years. So I wanted to raise that because Orkney is this kind of, sort of example of some of these big issues, because the cables in Orkney have been at capacity for some time to try, and we've got so much wind in Orkney, we want to export it so much of the time. The other thing that I think that John Gardner's question really nicely raises is that, what are the other options? How else could we basically come up with this extra and solve the energy or solve this intermittent problem? And of course, and you mentioned it when you started, Hayaatun, that is around storage. So one of the proposals that we've been looking at in Orkney through what was called the Reflex project, which is a UKRI demonstrator, was to balance the grid in Orkney across heat, power and transport, meaning that if the wind wasn't blowing, could we be having thermal storage, for example, and use that? So we're basically heating up hot water when we've got lots of energy, and then we can hold hot water for a long period of time when the wind isn't blowing, and then use it, when we've got the need to do so. You do the same thing with hydrogen. So hydrogen basically is made by, you take water and you split it into hydrogen and oxygen. And, again, when you've got a lot of renewable energy, you can either throw it away or curtail it, or you can basically use it to make hydrogen, which you can store and then turn the hydrogen back into electricity when, again, you might need it. Or you can have things like grid batteries. And of course, I also mentioned electric cars, which are grid batteries on wheels. And it's the same with home batteries. So some people have batteries on the side of the house for storing electricity. It's another small part of batteries that you can have, that you can link together. So one of the proposals that's being talked about, and is an important part of this whole discussion about local renewable energy, is having these what are called virtual power plants. By that I mean you have lots of people, maybe in a street or in an island or across a community, all have little bits of battery storage. And that might be linked to maybe a big hydrogen electrolyzer, but you can all basically collaborate together and share and socialize the electricity use. And that's one of the things that's being talked about, but it's going to take regulatory change. It's quite challenging, but these are some of the really exciting things that are ongoing at the moment that we're talking about and that we're trying to make happen.
Thank you, Laura. And I must say, the creativity that you're describing is so fascinating. Certainly not the way I was conceiving of this. So I'm definitely learning as we go here. I'd like to come to Sharon Bambaji's question, which is really important. It's back to this: who are we talking about with this term communities, and actually more generally consumers? And are we really just focusing on domestic energy consumption? But what about, the really important industrial, manufacturing, transport users of energy and their place in the system? And I wonder if Nick and Patrick, you'd like to come in on this to just give us a bit more of a sense of how you think that engagement connects with the topic that we're addressing today. Nick, would you like to go first?
I'm happy to. Yes, the industry is a very important topic on this. We've seen proposals coming out about how to decarbonise what are termed the industrial clusters. Progress is piecemeal on those. They are absolutely critical to hitting the 2035 carbon emission cuts. You need to take, I think, half of the carbon dioxide out of the industrial clusters. And that's going to be a blend of electrification of most of the processes, but also with some carbon capture and storage on things like cement production and so on. So that's a very important part of the debate. Going to local communities, I think the debate actually, for me, has two parts. It is about hosting major new infrastructure in some areas and how to get a respectful and sensible debate with communities about that. But it is all about the point that Laura was making just now. When you look at the maths of how to do this from a central perspective, we cannot get to our targets without making a lot of progress on active local energy systems. We are migrating from a world where energy was created a long way away from people in fossil fuel plants and just shipped in, and people could, just be passive about their consumption. I mean, this, I think, is an exciting prospect for communities, or we as engineers should certainly be making it so. But we will need that flexibility that comes from smart grids, smart homes, the use of smart meters, storage at all levels on the system, and embedded generation facilities. And so the issue for us is how to, at the same time as making that technical change, how do we make the institutional change to get away from the top-down governance structures, which just may have been, let's build a nuclear power station over there or a coal-fired power station over there. How do we get to the institutional structures which allow communities and with local authorities and industry to get the right blend of assets locally and to energize the community and excite the community in the blend of local resources and national resources?
Thank you, Nick. And Patrick, you previously touched on industrial clusters specifically, but I think Nick's rightly broadened out the question, and there's also sort of slightly related questions. I'm doing that thing of trying to pile too many questions in the interest of trying to get through as much as possible. So just humour me. But Sharon followed up, and also I think Maria Wood has also raised this question of where does equitable and effective energy demand management sit in this engagement process? So Patrick, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Right,
all of that.
Nice there. Yeah. Well, let me just take two strands on that. I mean, I think firstly, the demand reduction point is absolutely crucial here. I was a lead author in the last IPCC report in Assessment Round 6, and it was the first time that there was a chapter from the social science disciplines in the Climate Change Working Group 3 on mitigation. And in that, we looked at demand reduction really, really carefully and found that there was the potential to reduce energy demand by up to 50% by 2050 if concerted measures were undertaken. Now, I don't think this message has quite got through a lot of the time, because a lot of the modeling about future energy systems that takes place often takes demand as a given, or if anything says, well, we need to increase demand by this, this, and this. And a lot of opportunities to reduce demand are not perhaps being taken with the same level of gusto and energy as interests in very big supply side solutions happening around CCUS and hydrogen. And obviously we're talking about grids. We're interested in all of these technologies as well. It's not that we don't need generation and supply and transmission, but often the demand side reduction part of that equation is comparatively overlooked. And we do have a lot of social science capability in the UK in different investments funded by the ESRC, for example, in different universities. So we know a lot about this and about issues of equity and fairness that go with that. So I do think there's much more we can do on that, and there's a huge amount of potential. And as Nick said, it's about flexibility, not just reduced demand, but there's lots of inefficiencies and ways of thinking through that. But I think coming back to the point about industrial clusters, absolutely, this isn't just about how we do things differently in a smart home of the future, where we plug our EV into the solar PV system, etc. This is about large industrial users and retaining our manufacturing base in industrial clusters. The only problem I would say, having come through a 4-year research program around sense of place and just transition funded under the IDRIC program, is that when we went out to places, when we spoke to people in Ellesmere Port or Milford Haven or Grangemouth in Scotland, when you speak to people on the ground, there is profound suspicion and mistrust about the grandiose plans for technology deployment that they're beginning to hear about. And they don't feel part of those conversations as yet. And that needs to change if it's going to be a just transition. There are really promising efforts being made in Scotland to look at just transition, both at the national level through a Just Transition Commission, but also at the local level through initiatives like Just Transitions for Grangemouth. But we have to see those communities in a historical context. And this comes back a little bit to the kind of content that Laura was coming around, the richness of experience, of local experiences in places like Orkney, that in these industrial communities, they've been left behind for quite a long time. And you can't suddenly switch on trust, I'm afraid. You've got to take small and slow steps for people to trust what you're saying and to build relationships at the local level where people feel, well, they'll just stay away. I mean, they came to our university research events, but they were very slow to go to industry-led events. So we need to change those kinds of conversations, and we need to do it quickly if this is going to work and actually achieve just transition in practice in these industrial communities.
Really, really vital points, Patrick. I'm going to come back to Nick. I think Nick might want to add a few comments on that. I'll also ask Nick to mop up the question from John Dunkley on grid connections and whether they can be repurposed. And then I've got one follow-on for you, Nick. So if you give a fairly brief answer to that, I could throw in my next one. Thank you.
So I just wanted to add to Patrick's points about home insulation is absolutely critical. Our houses are very leaky. I think that should be integrated into the planning, the local planning for how to deal with energy alongside flexibility storage, embedded generation. But it gets overlooked time and time again, and it's critical. The other thing I wanted to add was, the great news about demand levels are the new technologies are more efficient. So those of us who've been involved with running the gas system, as an electrical engineer, I turned up and ran that for a bit, and I was stunned by how much energy is used at very cold temperatures and how fast it goes up as the temperature goes down. If you move peak heat from gas-fired boilers in homes to heat pumps, it's 3 times more efficient. That's 3 times less energy you've got to deal with at peak. And of course, the same thing could be said about electric cars. I think the internal combustion engine is 20% efficient or something. And you can, so actually the technology, as well as the things Patrick said, the technology is on our side. We can have technology that's much more efficient. In terms of grid connections, in some places, there certainly is the opportunity to reuse or restring transmission lines that have been used for other purposes, and some of the old nuclear power stations that are being retired are opportunities and are integrated into some of the grid planning.
Thank you, Nick. And I'm going to come back to Laura in just a second, but while I've got you, wanted to ask you the question about the interplay between national policy and how these opportunities play out at local level. So we're talking here across a number of different axes and scales, and obviously the work you did was triggered by a policy objective. Could you just say a little bit about how that national policy level objective and vision interplays either positively or negatively with the reality of what communities experience at a local level?
So I think national policy is still in the process of catching up with, in some senses, the technology opportunities. And national policy has continued to focus on big stuff. Nuclear power stations and CCS, they are important, but we know that just the math says you've got to do the things that I talked about earlier on the local system. So we have to have a tiered set of processes that can decide, as Patrick said, I think, national, regional, local approaches, and how they can be coordinated and brought together. And that means, having completely new approach at the local level, involving citizens, involving local authorities, involving local communities, and we are not there yet. Of course, there's been some very interesting words said around the creation of GB Energy. One of the 3 GB Energy objectives is to promote community energy. As somebody that has tried a lot less successfully, I think, than Laura to drive forward some modest community energy projects here in the Midlands, providing for local authorities and other key institutions enough resources so that they can engage on these quite technical and also complex, from a democratic point of view, issues is very important.
Thank you. Very helpful. Now, Laura and Patrick, I want to just spend a couple of minutes with you, returning to one of the overarching topics that I would like us to be able to walk away with a deeper understanding of, and that's how do we do this better? So what does it take to make conversations and engagement communities more effective, more impactful? You've both been living this and accepting that every community has particular characteristics, and so you can't just have a kind of cookie cutter approach. I'd love to hear from you, Laura, first of all, about what you think we have learned that we can simply take forward and hardwire into how we do this in the future.
That's an incredibly difficult question to answer, but a really important one. I think the thing that makes it difficult to answer is actually something which I think Patrick has already alluded to, and that is when you're taking a place-based approach, which, I think we're all agreed is really important. The word local has within it this intrinsic sense that places are different. It's both the wildlife, the communities, the histories, the energy histories, all those things create very different places. So what a just transition or a net zero or a low carbon future looks like is going to be different in different places. So I think the challenge from a policy perspective is how do you enable that kind of flexibility, not just in terms of a flexible grid, but also in terms of relationship with different kinds of communities who have these different histories, and the regulation is going to be able to support the different nature of what those renewable energies might look like, and what it needs to look like in terms of engagements with things like fuel poverty, which it feels like should be a whole separate discussion in itself, because it's such a crucial issue. It's really hard to talk about, going about buying electric cars or putting up micro wind turbines when you're dealing with something like, how do we keep people warm? So I just kind of feel like that's a piece of it. I think the second piece is also, thinking through what does it look like on the ground in practice to do some of the things that Patrick's talking about. What does place-led collaboration look like? So if we're going to kind of like think about, what infrastructures do we need where? Where do we want pylons, or what do we want our generation to be? The answers are going to be different in different places. But what does it look like to have research funding or project funding or community-led funding that is literally, community-led, right? Rather than technology-led, rather than starting with a question, which I can totally understand, which makes sense if you're an engineer to go, well, we've got this great bit of, hydrogen technology. We just got to test it and put it somewhere. Can you turn things around and say, okay, we want to work with this place. We are going to work with this organization, who's established, has good relations with the place. Let's have a chat with them and figure out of this range, this palette of technologies that might be relevant, how can we build something and co-create projects together? And actually, we might end up installing or building or putting on the ground something completely different to what we initially anticipated. So there's give and take on both sides. And, what does that look like in practice? How can we build projects that are place-led rather than just technology-led? Because we know these things have to work in practice and be in order for things to operate. So I'll leave it there. I have lots of other things to say about energy efficiency and innovation, but I think, to answer your question, that's where I would start.
Great. Thank you, Laura. And I'll give Patrick the chance to comment as well, please.
Right. I hadn't realized that the three of us had actually been practitioners in community energy initiatives of different kinds. You learn interesting things on these kind of conversations. I was involved in Exeter Community Energy for a while too, and it was a great learning experience. So, yeah, I mean, I think Laura's put it a lot nicely there. I don't need to repeat that. I think the only thing I'd add is that I've seen over and over again a sense of tokenistic engagement. It happens a bit late. It's generally one-way information provision. It's generally based on assumptions about communities like, well, we really don't want to give too much away because they're probably going to get in the way of our project and it's going to make things difficult. Or so I think anybody involved in energy transitions needs to think about trust at the beginning. How do we get over the fact that we're probably not going to be listened to in the first instance? How do we get across our ideas fairly and transparently and build conversations over time? So I think that's important. And so avoid tokenistic engagement, which happens again and again, and have listening and early engagement. Now that means that it's going to need to be resourced. So I think often what happens is that when we have large technology projects, the expertise or the resources isn't always there on the engagement side. And it does take time, and you do need expertise in order to do engagement properly and to have two-way communication going on over time. And as Laura was saying, I think what we need to imagine, and it comes back to an earlier point I made, is that we're not just thinking about how we get, say, a low carbon grid in place by 2050. We're trying to make good places to live. Everybody has a stake in making the area or the community that they live in a better place. There are always things that people need to work on. And if we can do some visioning around futures, both at societal and local levels in an inclusive way, if we can have conversations about what 2050 looks like in Grangemouth or in Norfolk or wherever there's controversy around particular technologies, we can bring people together. And I think what we found in the Access project and on our net zero task force work is that if we can find galvanizing issues that bring different kinds of stakeholders or communities together, people can get behind change instead of preventing change. They can get behind change and get for it because they see something positive coming out of that. That's not likely to be a piece of energy kit. It's likely to be something else. It's likely to be a safer environment for their children, or a more healthy environment, or cleaner air, or an end to local food poverty, for example. So we have to be able to connect things up. And as I said, we're in a context of environment and climate emergency. So for me, the biggest challenge around this is that often social scientists like myself say we need more dialogue, we need more participation, we need more talking, and that takes time, but we haven't got much time. We've got deadlines for 2030, we've got a situation of emergency, so we have to have realistic and pragmatic conversations as well, and they need to happen fast, and they need to start soon, and they're not going quick enough in my book, but we're getting there. So that's what I would like to see change.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm going to go to Nick and I'm going to ask him to also perhaps speak up positively about the role that engineers and engineering can play in helping in the context of this kind of community engagement. Because I think we're rightly pointing out lots of the pitfalls and the things that haven't always been done well, but equally they are an important part of this dialogue. So Nick, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I'm going to give you all a heads up that after that, because amazingly the time has run away, I'm just going to give you each a chance to give one piece of advice to an incoming government that has set ambitious targets for what it wants to achieve by 2030. And if nothing else today has reminded us that that won't be achieved without getting this kind of engagement right. So I'm going to give you the chance to give one pithy piece of advice, whether it's to the ministers, to Chris Stark sitting at Mission Control, or Jürgen Meyer at GB Energy. That's up to you. But first of all, Nick, come on. What about the engineers in this dialogue? What part do they have to play?
Well, thank you. I feel the need as the engineer out of the three of us to say, yes, absolutely. I think we're all as one on the dialogue with individuals, communities, society. Terribly, terribly important. But we need expertise in this as well. One of the things I said very early on in this debate is that this transition will be much easier to manage, certainly politically, if we're moving to a cheaper energy system. If we can't make that case to society it gets difficult politically. I do believe we can get to a cheaper system, but you have to have the right blend of technologies deployed. You have to optimize the system, otherwise it won't be cheaper. So it is important that we bring expertise to bear. And one of the things I would challenge, if we had time, and maybe on another occasion, Laura and Patrick, is how do we bring that quite complex expertise, the expertise of how all these different technologies work economically from an engineering point of view, how they integrate. How do we make sure that comes into the local discussion that we've been very passionate about on this call? The blend of the democracy and expertise. This is a time for expertise, technocratic expertise alongside democratic expertise. My final point, just to rise to your challenge, Hayaatun, about engineers, is I've said a few times that it's important that that this is cheaper. I sit in a lot of debates with engineers and economists about will it be cheaper. It is terribly important, I think, that we discuss that very maturely and very honestly with the public. But engineers have a role in making sure it is cheaper. And that's about innovation, about new technology. It's about system integration. And finally, it's about engaging with individuals and communities to make sure that we articulate the case and bring expertise to bear in those local discussions.
Thank you. And while you've got the floor, what's your piece of advice to the incoming government? Or not the new government.
Set out enthusiastically, passionately, set out a vision for a cheaper, cleaner energy system that is a blend of from large resources down to local communities and households, an exciting, clean, cheap energy system.
Thank you very much. And Laura, what would your piece of advice be?
Building exactly on what Nick just said, I would say is about starting and asking local places and communities what they have as a vision, what their lived experience is of a vision that's a low carbon, sustainable, resilient future for them going into the future, and then building your policy on top of that. Because I think speculating that is more than just a number. It's not about net zero carbon. It's that lived experience that Patrick said. So ask the communities, what do they want? What do they imagine? What do they vision? And then build your policy from there.
Fantastic. And Patrick, you get the last word on this.
Ooh, I better not mess up. I would just say, follow the social science. We have several decades of peer-reviewed evidence on what works in this situation. We have lots of good research. We've got lots of social science experts in this country. Make sure they're involved in these conversations. Make sure we're getting the engineers and the social scientists and other types of expertise in the room at the right time and have those conversations. Draw on the evidence and follow the social science.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all for rising to the challenge of my provocation. And actually, I guess, Patrick, you've pointed to why we've convened this panel, and this is a conversation that could have run a lot longer. We've covered a lot, but there's still a huge amount that we haven't had time to cover. We've got 2 more events where we'll continue the theme, but actually this also represents a shift in the way the Academy is seeking to undertake its work, which will be in partnership with communities and in partnership with other disciplines, not least social scientists. I would like to thank all of our panelists for a really stimulating discussion, and also everybody who joined online and who provided such thoughtful pieces of feedback and questions. If this conversation has sparked your interest or you've got any comments about the event, please do respond to the survey. You'll see there's a link in the chat, and we'll also follow up by email. And your feedback really does help us to make sure that we shape and improve future events. The next event in this mini-series is Transport Pathways to Decarbonised Mobility, and that will take place online again via LinkedIn on Tuesday, the 1st of October at 6 p.m. Please do stay tuned for updates on the next events in this series of critical conversations on our LinkedIn page, and you can also find all the previous critical conversations via the link in the chat below. But for now, I hope that we've inspired you to really embrace engagement across disciplines, across communities, and to be part of ensuring that we can deliver a just transition. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you all have a very good evening.